Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be recapping the 21-22 season for the San Jose Sharks. Now, we have to go back all the way to last year in the 2021 offseason, where this season essentially began. And it was a year after missing the playoffs for the second straight season that Doug Wilson still wanted to try and keep this team competitive and avoid missing the playoffs for a third straight year, which of course ended up happening for the first time in franchise history. And so there were two parts of the team that Wilson went out and specifically targeted. The first of which, and maybe the most important, would be the Sharks' goaltending. He bought out the last 3 years of Martin Jones's contract and decided to bring in an entirely new goaltending tandem. A trade with the Arizona Coyotes brought Aidan Hill over, and a signing in free agency brought over James Reimer. And both of these players ended up signing to 2-year deals. So I imagine the logic was that Aidan Hill and Reimer would sort of share responsibilities, at least for the first year, in a 1A, 1B type of situation. And then hopefully by the second year, Aidan Hill would have asserted himself as the starter, to where the third year, when Reimer leaves in free agency after his 2-year deal, Hill could be the new starter for the San Jose Sharks. Now, of course, that didn't end up working out exactly like that. I'll get to that a bit later, but this was the logic likely behind Doug Wilson, and it ended up being a decent choice in terms of a goaltending tandem. The other part of the team that Wilson actually targeted was the Sharks' bottom six. He felt as though that the Sharks' top six was good enough, which is again something I'll get to a bit later, but he felt as though the bottom six was lacking, and so he goes out, he signs Nick Bonino, he signs Andrew Cogliano, he trades for Lane Peterson, he re-signs Matt Nieto. He's trying at that point to foster competition in the Sharks' bottom six so that it just generally raises the level of play of all of the players there, and the Sharks could have a relatively competitive bottom six. Now, of course, you may be wondering, well, why did Wilson think that the top six was nearly good enough to win? Well, first of all, I suspect he was hoping for the rebounds of both Meyer and Couture, which, to his credit, actually did end up happening. But second of all, I suspect in the early parts of the offseason that Evander Kane was still part of the Sharks' plans heading into the next season, and that it wasn't exactly crystal clear that Kane would not play another game for the San Jose Sharks until probably a month or two before the actual season started. This is, of course, me giving Doug Wilson the benefit of the doubt, massively, but I imagine if he knew that, from the first minute of the offseason that Evander Kane was not going to play another game for the Sharks, that he would have been more committed to trying to find another top six player to replace him, because a 30-goal scorer like Evander Kane he was the Sharks' best player last season. It's not easily replaceable, even with Meyer and Couture rebounding. And so by the time that it was clear that Kane was not going to play, it was likely a bit too late, and Doug Wilson at that point was just hoping for some sort of minor miracle, that someone like LeBanc would rebound significantly, or that William Eklund would end up being like a 70-point scorer in his first immediate rookie season. Those, of course, did not end up happening, but I can understand the logic. And so with these moves made by Doug Wilson, it wasn't necessarily something that inspired a lot of hope in people. It wasn't something like, clearly the San Jose Sharks are going to be a playoff team. But if a few things indeed had fallen into place, maybe the Sharks could have snuck into a wild card spot, or maybe something like third place in the Pacific Division. Now, that would have taken a lot of things. It would have likely taken the rebound years of Meyer and Couture. We would have also had to have seen some sort of rebound year from Kevin LeBanc. We would have actually had to have seen a strong year from the Sharks' bottom six. That fostering of competition would have actually had to work out on the defensive side. Brent Burns would have not had to, have his game fall off any more so from getting older. We would have had to have seen a fully healthy Erik Carlson, Ferraro taking another step forward, Knyzhov taking a step forward after a strong first rookie season, and of course the goaltending tandem doing well. And while we saw a couple of those, the goaltending tandem didn't do too poorly, and Meyer and Couture did indeed rebound, there were just a few too many holes that ended up being there. Carlson did miss much of the season, only played 50 of the possible 82 games. Ferraro did not take a step forward. Knyzhov ended up being injured for the entirety of the season. Brent Burns did seemingly take a bit of a step back. The Sharks' bottom six was indeed extremely awful. Kevin Labanc did not even rebound. He somehow got even worse and then ended up getting injured and missing most of the season as well. And so generally, it's not that much of a surprise that the Sharks ended up missing the playoffs. They did slightly better than last season by coming 11th last in the league instead of 7th last, but that still leaves them with a 32, 37, and 13 record on the year, far below the 500 mark, which isn't even necessarily all that difficult to reach at the NHL level because of the fact that overtime losses do exist. And boy, did they exist this season. The Sharks lost 13 games in overtime. Now, technically, if they had won every single one of these games, they still wouldn't have made the playoffs, which is just going to show just how bad the season actually ended up being for the San Jose Sharks, but still an area to improve on for sure. Now, moving into the players here that led the way for the San Jose Sharks, we have Timo Meyer right there at the top of the list, just barely missing out on the point-per-game season. 77 games, he got 76 points, including 35 goals, and it was an extremely impressive rebound season from Timo Meyer. He had that great year in 18-19, signed a very valuable contract. A lot of people were saying, oh, Meyer's really going to explode and become an elite player in the league, but the next two seasons definitely didn't do him any favors. The 1920 season wasn't awful, and it was just the case of him being on a really bad team, but the 2021 season was definitely a massive step down for Timo Meyer, to the point where a lot of people were saying suddenly his contract was very bad, and that the Sharks should try and trade him at that point, even though his value was rather low. And so obviously it's a good thing they didn't. They retain him on the team, and he rewards with a fantastic bounce back season. And this wasn't just a good season for Timo Meyer where he just so happened to put up 76 points, got lucky with a few bounces. Timo Meyer was absolutely dominant in most of the shifts that he took on the ice. I would say 70% of the time that he came on the ice, he would make something happen in the positive sense for the San Jose Sharks, which is an extremely impressive number, although I obviously just pulled that out of absolutely nowhere. But Meyer had a fantastic season. He was far and away, in my opinion, the Sharks' best skater. The only player on the entire team who was even close to him in terms of being most valuable would be James Reimer. But besides the goaltending, there is a massive drop below Meyer to the next best player, and that would be Tommash Hurdle. And you might be thinking, oh, well, Hurdle only had 12 less points, still managed a 30-goal season. But in terms of how exactly they actually played, I felt as though Hurdle was many steps below Timo Meyer, because I mentioned Meyer was dominant most of the shifts he took on the ice. Hurdle, on the other hand, it felt as though didn't really have that same flair. I've mentioned this many times in the past, but back in the 18-19 season, Hurdle really was dominant almost every single time he stepped on the ice, which allowed him to have that close to 80-point season. But this year, I never really felt the same thing, and we saw early on this season, before Hurdle and Meyer ended up being placed together on the same line and really benefited, we saw Meyer at first on a first line with Couture and Dahlin doing exceptionally well, and Hurdle found himself frequently on a second line with both Balcers and Barabanov, and that was a second line that never really worked out, and Hurdle was just not really doing much to drive that line forward. He would occasionally have a very good game while playing on that line, but it always felt as though it was despite the fact that he wasn't necessarily playing that well, that he would suddenly end up with like a couple of goals just because Hurdle generally has a lot of skill to his game. And so while this was a good season from Tommash Hurdle, just as last season was, it's just not really giving me those same feelings as I had 3 seasons ago. And hopefully now with this big contract, that sort of monkey off of his shoulder, he can come in next season and actually get back to that point, so that when I assume Bob Booner would end up separating both Meyer and Hurdle, the Sharks can have a play driving forward on each of their first 2 lines. When it comes to the third player here on this list, that would be Logan Couture, who ends up putting up 56 points, 23 goals, 33 assists in the 77 games he played, which for Couture maybe 3 years ago isn't necessarily all that great, but compared to last season, which was just an absolute disaster for the Sharks captain, Couture definitely did have a rebound year. On top of that, you do have to take into account the fact that he frequently played with some, let's just say, lesser skilled players. I mean, just in the last dozen or so games of this season, he ended up on a line with both Nick Bonino and Matt Nieto, who, especially at the end of the season, didn't actually play terribly offensively, but they're no Timo Meyer or Tommash Hurdle. So Couture didn't necessarily get given a lot to work with this season. So the fact that he did still manage 56 points was quite nice to see. Still played a huge part in the Sharks' number 2 ranked, if I'm not mistaken, penalty kill in the entire league. So he's still a huge part of that and is still a huge part of this team. But hopefully going into next season that the Sharks maybe make some sort of improvements to their offseason, he can be given a bit of help offensively and maybe these numbers could even improve slightly. Next would be Brent Burns, who offensively actually did not have too bad of a year. 82 games played, as Brent Burns usually does. 10 goals, which is a bit low for Burns, but joined by 44 assists, and as such making up to 54 points. Pretty good, though it should be noted that Brent Burns did play a ton of ice time. I believe the most ice time that he has played in a season in his entire career. So clearly Brent Burns continues to be leaned on significantly, and I must say during the earlier parts of the season, in fact, if we just don't, talk about the last dozen or so games of the year, Brent Burns was kind of bad. There were so many games where Brent Burns was just a downright liability for the San Jose Sharks, even while getting, 26, 27, sometimes close and upwards of 30 minutes per game. And he just kind of didn't seem like he could keep up with the game as it was in the 21-22 season, because it should be noted that goal scoring was up significantly this season, and you can maybe point to, bad goaltending around the NHL. But it can also be pointed to is that the game is just generally continuing to speed up, and Brent Burns at this point, it just didn't really seem as though he could keep up with it early on. He definitely had a bit of a bounce back near the end of the season when he got placed back with his usual partner Mario Ferraro, who he started the season with and didn't look good. But it does make me worry that now that Brent Burns continues to climb up in age, he's definitely, obviously, not getting any younger, that if Bob Booner continues to lean on him, which I see zero indication why he isn't going to end up doing that, even when Brent Burns is making mistake after mistake, it's hard to imagine a world where the Sharks are going to get significantly better unless something like that changes, or unless Brent Burns somehow just doesn't age, or at least his game doesn't age. When it comes to the next player, that would be Alex Barabanov. He ended up with 39 points on the season in the 70 games he played, also with 10 goals on the year. Barabanov, at the start of the season, kind of bounced around the lineup a bit, though frequently did find himself in the Sharks' top 6, but near the end of the season found himself a home on the Timo Meyer, Tommash Hurdle line, and did a very good job as the third player in that trio. And Barabanov was the player who at the end of last season showed up at the trade deadline in exchange for Antti Suomela from the Toronto Maple Leafs, played 9 games for the Sharks on a line with Evander Kane and Tommash Hurdle, and looked very, very good. And so we're quite hopeful going into this season that he would be able to perform. In fact, I had a bold prediction prior to the start of the season that Barabanov could end up putting 50 points up on the board. Now, 39 points in 70 games, if we were to prorate that over an 82-game season, that would be about 46, 47 points. So he came very close to that 50-point mark, and I continue to be impressed by Barabanov. I thought he was a very, very solid player, not someone who's going to be consistently strong. Reminded me a lot of Jonas Donskoy, though had definitely a bit more consistency than Donskoy, as he didn't go like 30 games without a goal multiple times per season. But still, Barabanov seems to be more of like a flex second line player, and not so much the guy who you want finishing off your first and essentially only offensive line. He did an admirable job, but you're hoping that it's not something that you're going to do on a competitive team if the Sharks want to make that going into next season, though of course we still have to see if whether or not the Sharks even re-sign Barabanov in the first place. Now, 6th on this list and not included would actually be Erik Carlson. In the 50 games he played, I believe he had about 30 points, which actually over a full 82 game season is close to 50 points, or actually it might even be slightly above 50 points. So not a terrible season for Erik Carlson. But again, the just major issue is that he can't stay healthy. The Sharks are just hopeful that he would be able to play close to, at the very least, a full 82 game season, and that just doesn't seem to be happening at this point. And I know Carlson could have played the end of the season. I believe that is what he has said. He could have played through his injury, but there was no reason to because the Sharks were out of the playoffs, which is, of course, fair enough. But still, you're hoping that he wouldn't have to actually play through any injury and he could just stay fully healthy, because it's not as though he plays such a hard-hitting physical game that you expect him to get injured time, here and there. It seems as though he plays much more on the skilled size compared to what you see in the defensive zone. So it shouldn't be that difficult to remain healthy, and yet it seems to be a big issue for Carlson time and time again. Onto the goaltending side of things, like I said earlier on, the Sharks coming in, we're hoping for some sort of 1A, 1B setup from both Aidan Hill and James Reimer, but that didn't end up happening, and that wasn't necessarily because one goaltender won the net, though you could definitely argue James Reimer did even when Aidan Hill was healthy, but it was because Hill did get injured for a very, very long period of time. He missed basically the entire last half of the season, and so the Sharks even ended up picking another goaltender up at the trade deadline, and now the Sharks are essentially juggling 3 different goaltenders for just 2 actual roster spots. Now, moving into the goaltender stats, we of course had James Reimer, who led the way. I mentioned earlier that the only player who was even close to most valuable on this team to Timo Meyer was indeed Reimer. He started 46 games for the Sharks, so over half of the season, yet only had 19 wins. That looks bad, but it should be noted that he had 10 overtime losses, and the vast majority of those overtime losses were nowhere near his fault, because the Sharks were just absolutely awful at 3-on-3 this season. So he, with a half-decent 3-on-3 team, he probably gets up to 24, 25 wins and actually looks much more respectable. He was also sitting at a 2.9 GAA, which looks bad, but when you compare that to his save percentage, which is a significantly more respectable .911, this shows that James Reimer was facing a ton of shots game in and game out. And so while he was letting in maybe 3 goals per game or close to 3 goals per game, it was because he was facing, 35, 40 shots time and time again for the Sharks, so it's hard to necessarily get that GAA down. I've mentioned this before in previous videos, that when you have a high goals against average and a high save percentage, it usually means that your team is not doing a very good job in front of you, and if you have a low save percentage and a low goals against average, it usually means that as a goaltender, you're kind of getting carried by the team defense in front of you. Now, moving to Aidan Hill, he only ended up starting 22 games this season, though actually won about 10 of them, and had a 2.66 GAA, but like you see with Reimer here, his save percentage was actually lower, even though with a lower goals against average of a .906 save percentage. So Hill seemed to have the team play slightly better in front of him. I don't think Hill had a terrible season. He certainly had a few games that really stood out in a positive way, but of course the sample size was also rather small. Like I said, he missed about half of the season. Then there is Capo Cac, who came in over from the Minnesota Wild at the trade deadline this season, started 10 games for the Sharks, yet only won 2 of them. A few of them, I would say, were his fault, though a few of them he definitely played extremely well, and the Sharks just completely let him down, and you'd see that in his stats, I guess you could say, a 2.7 GAA, which isn't too bad, as well as a .916 save percentage, which actually is quite good. And so it's going to be an interesting choice for Doug Wilson going into next season. Reimer, it seemed as though he was the perfect opportunity to trade him at this year's trade deadline, because you could have Kakinen start and then maybe bring up someone like Sawchenko as the backup, because Sawchenko did play a couple of games this season and looked not half bad, and yet Reimer was retained on the team, and so now it seems as though Reimer could get moved during this off season, especially since he did still finish the year quite strong and didn't get injured, so there's no worries, and that Hill and Kakinen could be a duo going into next season. But honestly, I have no idea what the play is. So going into this offseason, we have to say, well, what does this mean for the Sharks going forward? They're going to have probably the 11th overall pick in this upcoming draft. It's technically possible that they win the draft lottery over these next few days, and that would be an amazing stroke of luck for the San Jose Sharks. But if we assume that they won't get lucky, they'll have that 11th overall pick, so they'll be able to pick up a player who will be good, hopefully, in the next couple of years, but probably won't be able to make an immediate impact next season. And so you're hoping for a player like William Eklund to come over over and actually do well. You're probably hoping for one of those junior players who has been having a pretty good season, like a Brandon Coe or a Tristan Robbins, to come over and potentially be a solid player. Hoping that Thomas Bordeleau, who had a very, very strong last few games of this season once he came over from Michigan from the NCAA, you're hoping that he can carry that into a full 82-game season next year, and maybe with a couple of free agent signings to help increase this team's goal scoring, and with, maybe Ferraro taking that step forward that you were hoping to see this season, and Knyzhov being healthy and actually playing well. There's technically a possibility that the Sharks could make the playoffs next season, but it will take some fanciful maneuvers during this offseason from the Sharks' new GM, who we of course do not know who that's going to be just yet. Class dismissed.